All That's Left is made possible by our Patreon supporters. To help us continue this work, please consider contributing at patreon.com/leftvoice, and make sure to visit our website at leftvoice.org. Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Today we're talking about President Biden and the Democrats' recent betrayal of U.S. railway workers. At the end of November, faced with an impending rail strike, Biden urged Congress to impose a contract on rail workers. 2 days later, on November 30th, the House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly to sell the workers out. Only 8 Democrats in the House ended up voting against these two anti-worker bills, one of which included no sick days, and the second of which included just 7 sick days, which was half of what the workers were demanding. Among those who voted in favor of the bills were the members of the Progressive Squad. All members voted unanimously for the bill that didn't meet workers' full sick leave demands, and all but one of these members voted for both bills. In other words, the so-called pro-labor president and members of the House that have been endorsed by or are members of the Democratic Socialists of America sold out workers and actively undermined class struggle. Today, Left Voice editor James Hoff is back on the podcast, and we're also joined by Jason Koslowski, a college professor and union organizer in Philadelphia. James and Jason go over the background of the rail situation and the events that led up to it. But more importantly, we talk about what this event says about the Democratic Party, about President Biden, the role of the state, and of the squad. Jason and James, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thanks guys for being here. So I think everyone who's listening to this particular podcast probably has a sense that rail workers at the end of last month, beginning of this month, were betrayed. If you'll forgive my terrible joke here, you might say that they were thrown under a train. And I think people also who've been following the news have a sense that Joe Biden and Democrats were the ones who ended up going against the wishes of the rank and file in some cases. But could you guys provide just like a quick recap of what happened and what it was that led to these events?
Oden, I'm happy to provide a little background. I think it's good to sort of go back to the beginning a little bit and think a little bit about the contract struggle that led to this moment of betrayal, as you say. So, you know, the rail workers had been in this contract struggle for a couple of years. They had not been getting the demands that they were asking for. A lot of those demands were about, later in the contract struggle, were about sick days. Rail workers are notoriously overworked, and they don't have schedules that they have hardly any control over their own schedules. And so, you know, sick days was a kind of compromise. It was a way for them to try to just get some days that they could use for, you know, emergencies, or just to be able to have a day for their kid's birthday or something. Because a lot of the times they're on call, 7 days a week, sometimes 24 hours a day. A lot of them work. I've read a lot of them will work 330 days a year or more. So they're working practically every day of the year. So, you know, and then of course it was also about wages, and it's also about the demands were also about scheduling, right? I mean, they're running. They have been the rail companies have been doing what Kim Moody calls lean production for about a decade now. They've slashed the workers by about a third. And they're running these trains on fewer and fewer workers than they used to. And they're running, you know, and all the other things associated with running the trains, they're doing with fewer and fewer workers. It's putting workers in danger, and it's making the job harder. So, these were a lot of the core demands that they had been fighting over for a couple of years. And look, any other union with a private, this is a private employer, but any other union that wasn't subject to the Railway Labor Act, for instance, probably would have already gone on strike by this point or started taking work actions of one kind or another. But the Railway Labor Act forbids that. And it basically allows, at least until all other chances have been exhausted, it forbids any strike or work actions. And so, when the contract came to a head and it looked like there might be a strike brewing, that's when Biden intervened, and first intervened with mediation. And then when that didn't work, when it looked like the workers still didn't want that crappy contract that was mediated, he intervened with what's called a presidential emergency board. And he used that presidential emergency board to basically force both sides to accept a contract. And it was a contract that was slightly better than the one that had been negotiated previously for workers, but not really, and not even remotely close to what they needed and what they wanted. And so when that had expired, because again, the workers eventually have to say yes to a contract up until Congress votes, apparently. And so when it seemed like they weren't going to accept that contract that was decided with the presidential emergency board, that's when Biden said, hey, Congress has to act. And that's when they, Democrats and Republicans and the House and the Senate voted to force this contract on these workers. So that's a little of the background. I think folks know what happened in the vote. But Jason, did you want to add more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to add just like a couple things about sort of the deeper roots here, that the clash that we're seeing here between rail workers and Biden and the Democrats is these things are like baked into the capitalist system, right? Like James, you were talking about, there was this lean model of transportation that reduce the number of workers, increase their hours, increase their workload, and it has these deeper roots in especially in the U.S. 70s and 80s, the just-in-time production model to try to restore profitability in the U.S. after the stagflation crisis. So reduce the amount of downtime for workers, reduce the amount of time of any unprofitable use of your capital. And so all of that has meant that transportation logistics have become really brittle. You're working now with fewer workers on really sort of fragile lines of transport. Things have to get to places and move on very quickly. And so that has sort of meant two things. One, these sorts of crises between workers and the bosses become sort of more inevitable. And two, workers actually wind up having more leverage in these systems. Like Kim Moody, who you referenced, I think does a really great job of talking about that power that workers have in logistics. So much in capitalism today depends on getting things faster and faster and faster, and workers are standing at that choke point. But there's also this economic problem happening right now. Why would the Dems, who claim to be pro-labor, shut down union democracy, attack union workers right now? Well, all of the signs are pointing towards a recession. The ruling class is shaking, right? We see the Dow dropped at one point 900 points today, now something like 730 points today. It looks like the economy is headed for another recession. The tech market, which had sort of been buoying up the stock market, is showing all these signs of problems. And so coming out of the so-called COVID recovery, we're seeing a super fragile economy. And what we see with Biden and the Democrats forcing through a bad contract on workers against their own votes, against workers' own votes, is they're trying to shore up an economy that the Democrats and the ruling class, the bosses, are not at all sure is going to be very good in a year or 2 years. The International Monetary Fund, for example, has a growth rate prediction just a few months ago saying in 5 years growth rate of GDP was going to be something like 1.5 or 1.2%, which is like nothing, typically bourgeois economists say 2% GDP growth is a sign of health. We're talking about 1.2 in 5 years, and they've moved that timeline up. It's that stagnating growth looks like it's coming even sooner. So I think we see, what does Marx say, that the politicians are the executive board of the ruling class. We see the Democrats stepping in to try to preserve profitability for the ruling rich.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. That's such a good point about the sort of fragility of the economy at this particular moment. And I agree. I think Moody's points in that he makes in On New Terrain are more relevant now than they were when he wrote the book, because of the supply chain bottlenecks and because of the economy. And yeah, I think it's clear that when Biden first intervened before the election to force that second contract through, that was on his mind, that a rail strike was really going to hurt his image as someone who can lead the economy, as it were. And yeah, he just kicked that down the field, right, until after the elections. And this is his relationship to labor, is he's trying to present himself as a pro-labor president, but he didn't want to crush a labor strike before the election either. So he bought himself enough time to wait and do it until after the election. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that wider context is super interesting. This broader economic context that this occurred in, and I mean, there's so many different elements or aspects of the situation that are really interesting to dig into. And I wanted to pick up on, James, one of the points you made toward the end there about President Biden and the Democrats, because as you know, President Biden calls himself the pro-labor president. In fact, I think a lot of people, Biden himself, but also a lot of his supporters during 2020 were saying he'd be like the most pro-labor president in U.S. history and things like that. And the Democrats, of course, pose as being on the side of the workers, especially counterposed against the Republicans. And so, I guess as a sort of general question here, what does this situation and what occurred with the railway workers tell us about President Biden and tell us about the Democratic Party?
Well, I mean, I'll offer a really short answer. Maybe Jason wants to say a lot more about this, but I mean, it just reveals that the Democrats have never been a party of working people. They're not a working class party. They're a bourgeois party, and they rule for the interests of the owning class, the bourgeoisie, or the ruling class. And that's, for a lot of people, I think that's a hard pill to swallow. A lot of people still have, working class people even still have faith that the Democrats are somehow going to be better on labor. And I think this is just such an incredible example of why that's not the case.
Yeah, to pick up on that, right? I mean, we see there is still a lot of faith in the Democrats and Biden as a this idea that he's a pro-labor president, in the squad, as so sort of so-called progressive Democrats. And you sort of see where this faith comes from. Both parties have done a stunning job of attacking and dismantling working class and oppressed ways of fighting back, to try to make it so that it seems that the only game in town for working class and oppressed people is to choose between the Democrats and the Republicans, right? So the goal is to try to sort of create that faith, but we just see again why that faith is misplaced, and why we need faith in something else, faith in ourselves, right? As working people, working class people, oppressed people. I'm thinking of, what Gramsci says, right? Gramsci says, it's not enough for the ruling class to just sort of attack its enemies. Like, that's just not good politics, right? That just makes an unstable society, right? You got to try to convince your enemies that they are on your side. You have to make them believe in you and have faith in you. And that's what we see the Democrats doing again and again, right? That, they've sort of Biden has promised that he's going to be pro-labor, for example. And this is that sort of attempt to create that faith, to win over the working class to the side of the rulers and the ruling rich, right? And what's so interesting and so horrible about this situation with the rail workers is that the curtain gets pulled back, right? We see what Lenin was talking about when he says that politics is concentrated economics, right? We see what really matters after all of the rhetoric, all the we care about labor and all this stuff. We see now what is really at stake, and what's at stake is profits, right? The rubbers hit the road, and when profits are at stake in a faltering economy, then the decision goes with the ruling class. It goes with the rich, not the working class. So I think it just shows again, whatever faith we have to have in the fight for a different world, it has to be in ourselves, right? Working class and oppressed people, we're the only ones that we can rely on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add, with regards to Biden, Jason, you and I wrote an article explaining a year after his presidency why he's definitely not a pro-labor president, even though that's the way he wants to sell himself. And it's clear that Biden, I think especially after the pandemic, especially now that we're seeing these increasing levels of working class consciousness and these new unionization drives and the sort of movements toward strike actions, even if the number of major strikes are not necessarily increasing or increasing very much, there's clearly a sort of a trend developing here. And it seems to me that Biden is almost the ruling class's perfect candidate to address that quote unquote problem of working class power, because, he is able to sell himself as a friend of labor, as someone who is, friendly with the labor bureaucrats. His new Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, has these kinds of working class bona fides, as it were, and he's made a lot of promises as well. Promising to pass the PRO Act, for instance, and he's come out in support of labor unionization at like Amazon and other places. But then he also turns around and he uses the stick as well as the carrot, and this is an example of that. And I think he's sending a message to his labor bureaucrat friends that you're only going to have so much room to work with here, and sending a message to working people that actual working class organization using the methods of working class struggle like strikes are not the way to go. That is what Biden is trying to tell the working class, I think. And what he's trying to tell them, and I imagine we're going to get to this, Oden, when we talk about the squad, but, I think he's using the progressive wing of the Democratic Party as a way of sort of getting people to buy into this idea that that working people can make gains by using the legislature, by working within the halls of power, by using the state as an arbiter in class conflict. And that's how movements are co-opted. And I think that is one of the things that Biden is up to right now.
Yeah, can I add a few things to this? So first, yeah, I think we see again and again this dynamic of Democratic Party sort of puts itself out there as this pro-labor party and then betrays or undercuts exactly that thing. And I think it's so important to see the problem here is not this or that Democrat, right? The problem is not that there isn't a good enough Democratic president or good enough senators. This party was built over the better part of about a century by the ruling class to be their vehicle, right? It's not just a bucket sitting there that you can just sort of fill up some radical stuff and make it better. It's a sophisticated, massive, hyper hierarchical bureaucracy to ensure that the result you get is good for ruling rich people, right? Just look at the revolving door between functionaries in the Democratic Party and the corporate world. Just look at the mega donors that to the Democratic Party. Kim Moody again, in his most recent book, Breaking the Impasse. Breaking the Impasse has this stunning first chapter that talks about the internal mechanisms that the party has to ensure that dissent in the party from people like AOC or Bernie is whittled away, chipped away, to make sure that these folks steadily but constantly move to the right and have as little influence as possible over the creation of the policy of the party. So I think it's so important to see the picture holistically or dialectically, right? To see that the party is a dynamic bureaucracy designed to create the result that we just saw, something bad for workers and good for bosses. And another example of this that I think has gotten less play in the news is the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, that was set up in the night between 1930s and 1940s as a national body to adjudicate labor law, right? And Biden has made these grand statements about the NLRB. He's changed the composition of the NLRB to be apparently more pro-worker. Okay, but the NLRB is radically underfunded. It's profoundly hard for it to enforce any of the things that people point to and say, oh, look, this is like a really great pro-labor thing. And so this is another example, I think, of a really sophisticated bureaucracy designed to undercut worker power. But I also think there's really good news in here, right? For all the bad stuff that's happening, I think exactly like James was saying, the fact that Biden and the Democratic Party stepped in here shows that there is a mortal fear of strikes and a recognition of the power of workers to shut down huge sectors of the economy, right? Just the fact that there is that recognition, I think, points in a perverted way, in a weird way, to the power that we have as workers to make serious problems for capitalism and win massive concessions. And the last thing I'll just say here about this is that I think it's exactly right that the line that the Democratic Party has tried to walk for about 90 years or so, 80 years or so since the New Deal is to try to embrace unions in some sort of way so that they can undercut the ability to strike as maximally as possible, right? To try to bring unions faith not in themselves, not to fight for themselves, but in a sort of bureaucratic leadership that's beholden to people like Joe Biden and to the Democratic Party, right? So I think we see the mortal fear of striking in the Democratic Party and the constant attempt to make it harder and harder and harder and harder to strike. And I think that also just shows that's where our power is, right? That militancy to control our labor, to stop the flow of profits, right? Because we're the source ultimately of all the profits.
Yeah, I feel like this leads really nicely into this discussion about the strategic perspective of socialists and the role of socialists or so-called socialists in Congress. Because I think, okay, like to leftists, maybe Biden's move wasn't super surprising because I think every leftist is skeptical of Biden, even if they support someone else from the Democratic Party. But I mean, I do think a lot of people on the left were surprised and disappointed in what the squad did, as you guys have both alluded to. So just for any listeners who maybe aren't super up to speed on what happened, the squad, which is composed of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamal Bowman, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, Cori Bush. I think that's pretty much it. All of them ultimately voted to impose the contract, even if I think Rashida Tlaib refused to vote on just like one of the measures or something like that. So it's funny. I mean, Jason, you mentioned that, sometimes there are voices of dissent from more progressive Democrats or people like AOC, but I mean, in this case, we didn't even get like much of a voice of dissent at all. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into some of these topics you guys just mentioned, and what this ultimately says about like the squad and the squad's politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that the squad voted this way is, first of all, not a surprise. I think that for a lot of working people watching that vote, it felt like a betrayal. But I think that vote is really consistent with the politics of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is to really just try to be a little bit to the left of the ruling class, to try to make. They operate with the idea of making things a little bit better in a slow manner. And the fact that so many of them, with the exception of Tlaib, voted for that original resolution to basically force this contract on these workers, they did it as a legislative maneuver. I mean, in their eyes, and they were fighting for the workers. They were doing this because they wanted to get a slightly better contract for this particular group of workers. And from their sort of narrow legislative perspective, agreeing to that first piece of legislation was the way to get those sick days. And that is just so indicative of the failure of the entire political strategy of the Squad, of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, of the Democratic Socialists of America who support them, and of this idea among working people and the left everywhere that we can work within the Democratic Party to either pull them further to the left or to just win gains until we have enough seats to do something of some actual substance. And so, I don't know if I would call this a betrayal so much as just the inevitable result of a terrible politics. And this is just really highlighting the failure of their politics.
I don't have a ton to say about this that would go beyond what James said. Other than this, I think we see the internal mechanisms of the Democratic Party as a bureaucracy working really, really well here, right? That for the Squad to dissent in some serious way and insist on worker democracy or something is almost unthinkable, because it would pit them so seriously against the party leadership when it comes to an issue that is of absolute existential importance for the leadership of the party and for the ruling class, right? Profits at a time when it looks like the economy's going down the toilet, right? And so there's all of these mechanisms inside the Democratic Party to enforce that party discipline. For example, dissenters won't get help with their elections. They won't be put on the committees that they want to be put on. They won't have influence within the party, and so on and so forth. So there is inside the party itself these carrots and sticks to ensure party discipline. So the problem is not like, if we just had just a real radical in the Democratic Party, that this party is a system that makes sure that doesn't happen, right? So it's a systemic issue.
No, I think that's a super important point, Jason. Yeah, this isn't the failure of one or two representatives, and not only the political failure on the part of the Squad. You're right; it has to do with the structures of the party itself, and that's why that working people can't build power within the Democratic Party. I mean, there's lots of reasons, but that is one of the primary reasons. I agree with you. And of course, that's why working people need to build a party of their own and stop messing around with the Democrats.
Yeah, James, you mentioned earlier the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and that organization is a really important piece of this discussion that we're having about the Squad and the more progressive elements of the Democratic Party. Could you guys talk a little bit about how DSA leaders responded to this? And I was hoping also to discuss a little bit about like what these events and what the Squad did and things like that, what that says about DSA leaders' strategy.
The article that came out that was from Branco about the deal came out right after the deal. It was a celebration.
That's Jacobin's Bronco Marcheteach, right?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks. So for Jacobin, it was like spiking the football and celebrating, and that was a concession, right? The unions were asking for 14 days. They got 7 rammed down their throats. That's a concession, right? So just on that small part alone, I think is awful. Let alone the fact that this is completely stomping on actual worker democracy, right, on the actual votes of a majority in these in the railway unions.
The Jacobins' position has been sort of all over the place on this. I think Marketich's was particularly bad, a particularly bad early take on it. I mean, with regards to the DSA, though, I mean, a lot of these members of the squad are DSA members themselves. AOC, Jamal Bowman, I believe Corey Bush is also. Is that correct? I'm not certain. And the DSA has not responded to this betrayal with any kind of actual with any real criticism. The National Political Committee released a statement in which they said they were disappointed with the votes that their members took, and that was effectively it. The National Political Committee issued a statement basically saying, we don't think that you made the right vote, but there's no consequences for it. And that statement did not say anything about it. It didn't offer any censure. It didn't offer any consequences for that vote. And I think a lot of members of the DSA are extremely unhappy about this. Certainly, people to the left in the DSA have been very critical of this. And this is just another one of those litmus tests for the organization. I think Jamal Bowman's support for Israel was another example of this. It just shows that it's an organization that cannot hold their representatives accountable, and that's a really important part of any political organization.
I think the situation we're in right now, that the working class in the U.S. is in right now, shows how really dangerous and bad the idea of an inside strategy of the DSA is, dirty break or whatever of the DSA leadership. Right, so we have a real surge of unionizing this year. We have folks unionizing places that people have been trying to unionize for decades, right? Like Starbucks and now Amazon, all over the place. We have a uptick in militancy, people striking more this year, and just a small in a chunk of this year that was more than the entirety of last year. And I think we're seeing from the Democratic Party in forcing a bad deal on workers a fear, a real terror in this faltering economy, a terror that profits will be upset even more than they are. And in this context, I think to give the faith, to help propagate the faith that somehow the party built by our enemies will help us, I think now is what is it is more dangerous than it's been to spread that idea than it has been in a long time. Because workers are organizing and fighting back, and this plays so perfectly into the strategy of the Democratic Party. It works so well for them. But I also see there's this, but now's it's not just a time of danger. I think it's this incredible opportunity. Like the Democratic Party for so long has said with very little consequences that it is a pro-labor party. And it has been forced, I think, through objective conditions, right? The economic situation they're in. They've been forced to show their hand, right? They are anti-worker. They will stomp on union democracy for the sake of bosses' profits. So the class nature of the Democratic Party, right? It's not a coalition that looks out for the good of everybody. It is there to help bosses maximize profits. That has become clearer in the last, 15 days than it's been, I think, in a long time. So there's this incredible opportunity, right, to say we need something besides an inside strategy. It's not working, and it works against us, right? The fact that the Democratic Party is run by our enemies for our enemies, I think is clearer now than it's been in a long time, I think, to a wider sector of people.
That's a great point, Jason. And these are DSA's representatives in the House. And we have to ask ourselves, how would a real socialist act in this situation, right? Instead of just trying to use some legislative maneuvering to win a few sick days, A real socialist representative, first of all, of course, would have absolutely refused to force workers to accept a contract that they didn't want. Would have refused, as you said, that complete betrayal of workers' democracy by forcing them to take this contract. But also would have recognized, and I think this gets at what you're saying about what an extraordinary moment we're in and how much opportunity there is. They would have recognized the power of a strike versus the power of passing, winning some slight gains, which is what they focused on. They would have instead recognized the power of a strike and told these workers, if you're unhappy with this contract, then you should use your labor power to win a better contract. You should walk out. Obviously, that's what any socialist worth anything would have done in that situation, was to simply say, I refuse to. Not only do I refuse to sign this, but I think I actually would encourage the workers to walk out. And if people are worried about the consequences of a rail strike, if they're worried about jobs, supposedly so many jobs were supposed to have been lost, which I think is bullshit. It was just profits mostly that would have been lost if there had been a rail strike. But they would have said, look, if we're worried about this, then the rail companies should cough it up. They're making incredibly record profits for at least the last 2 years. They've been making skyrocketing profits off of these workers who we know are being worked to the bone. Like I said, working 300 days a year sometimes. That would have been like the bare minimum for an actual representative of the working class to do. And that carries a lot of power and a lot of weight. And that would have provided a chance to really change people's minds about the power that they have as working people, not just rail workers, but workers everywhere. But instead, the squad sent the exact opposite message to working people. They sent them the message that if you just keep voting hard enough, if we can just get enough of us in here, next time we'll succeed, and we'll win some sick days, or we'll get a slightly better contract. That's a really dangerous idea, and it's as we've been talking about, Jason. It's one that the Democratic Party has used to its advantage for almost a century.
Yeah, can I add on to that too? This is right. Can you imagine actually having a real socialist being able to draw the lessons on this mass scale about just how horrible the Democrats are attacking worker rights? And another major problem with the idea that of this sort of inside strategy is, let's just elect some of the right people in the Democratic Party, is that it gives this illusion that those folks will sort of tinker with labor law. And once you tinker with labor law in here, all of a sudden, all of us can start organizing, which flips history exactly on its head. It just does not work like that, right? So labor law is constructed, right? It was the labor law that sort of was laid between the 1930s and the 1940s, and that's sort of been developed since then. It exists to stop workers from using their power, right? In all of the millions of ways, through arbitration procedures, through the sort of backroom dealings that we saw Biden doing with the labor bureaucrats and all this stuff. The labor law in the United States is a carnival game that is designed to make workers lose. The approach is to break the law. This law takes away our power, so it's militant struggle from below by workers themselves, breaking that law, that makes things actually change. And history just constantly shows that, right? It was the huge upsurge in militant labor actions between 1930 and 1933 that got the first part of the Wagner Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, passed in 1933, that legalized unions. And then it was the terror of striking that got the 1935 Wagner Act that expanded unions' rights after that. And all of that law, of course, was designed to sort of defang labor, but acting like you can just sort of get some folks in the Democratic Party to tinker here and there with the law, and then all of a sudden workers have power, exactly gets history wrong, right? It gets it on its head, and instead of it's on its feet, it flips it upside down.
And that's such an important point about the power of strikes and the power of labor. Imagine what would have happened if these workers had gone on strike, even just for a day, even if they had gone on strike in the period between the House vote and the Senate vote, or if they had gone on strike just for a few days. Even if they hadn't won a better contract, the message that it would send about the enormous power that working people have, that this country doesn't run without them. We need that reminder. We need that reminder all the time, because that's how we win. And we're seeing that a little bit. We haven't mentioned this yet. I mean, we're talking about rail strikes, but there's huge rail strikes happening in the UK right now. And not just rail strikes, but nurses today, the same day we're recording this, went on the 15th, also went out in strike as well. Tens of thousands of nurses for the National Health Service. I read it's the first time in almost 75 years these nurses have gone on strike. And I can't help but think that strike by those rail workers was an inspiration for these nurses. You know, it made their strike easier. It made their decision to take action that much easier, knowing that there's other workers out there fighting as well. And strikes can be sort of contagious. We know, teachers in one state start striking, and all of a sudden you've got states everywhere, teachers in states everywhere going on strike. This could have been a moment like that. And the DSA's representatives squelched that and seemed to, and not only did they squelch it, they acted like they were doing the right thing by doing that. And that they were being pragmatic. And I think that's the problem with too many of our, supposed representatives of the working classes, that they're far too pragmatic.
Yeah, and just to add to this as well, is that strikes win major things for the working class way past just the bargaining units that are in question. So an example is, 50,000 grad workers on strike in California, and I'm here in Philly. I teach at Temple University. Grad students here. Watching that closely, talking about it, discussing it. They were taking grad students here at Temple took a strike authorization vote, 98% authorized. All of a sudden, my brother-in-law goes to University of Pennsylvania grad school. They got a 40% raise, right? And that's not a mistake, right? The bosses are watching all of this. So these material gains for the working class happen not just in this one place, but when workers start flexing the muscles that they have, everybody starts taking notice. Definitely other workers and the bosses as well. So to squelch a strike is bad, just up and down the line.
So I feel like this brings me to a question that I kind of wanted to conclude with. When I want to look a little bit to the future, I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you both was, what does this mean for labor and for the labor movement? And you've both already touched on this a little bit, but how do we fight back against these kinds of attacks? And what really is the way forward for workers and for the left as a whole?
I think we have to be pretty honest about what has happened. This is clearly a defeat for the labor movement. I think it's certainly not a defeat of the labor movement. It's not a definitive defeat in any ways. It's not going to cause a permanent shift, but it is definitely a temporary defeat, and it shows, as Jason was saying earlier, just how scared the ruling class is, and how willing they are to strike back at this particular moment. And this is a good example of that. It's nothing like the Patco strike, for instance, in which several thousand air traffic controllers lost their jobs. But it does feel like it's kind of approaching that level of crackdown from the state. And so, I think one of the lessons that what we've been trying to argue this whole time is working people need to recognize that the state doesn't have their interest at heart, and that they're not going to win gains by using the state. So I think that's, and I do think that is a conclusion that a lot of people are probably drawing at this time. I can only imagine. Uh, I mean, the rail workers I've spoken to, of course, are outraged by this decision, and they're also outraged by what they see as the betrayal of their leaderships. They were ready to go on strike, several months ago before the election, and the bureaucracies uh, took that tentative deal and started another period of another cooling off period, which meant technically that they were not allowed to strike for several more months. And a lot of rail workers saw that as a real betrayal. The things I was talking to folks about and the things I was reading online on like Reddit were basically saying, "Hey, look, we were ready to go, and the day before you pulled the rug from under us, and we lost all of that power and all of that momentum." And it turns out that is exactly what happened, because 6 months later or so, when after the election, they weren't able to go out and strike in response to this congressional vote. And so, I think these workers are it's a defeat, but it's one of those defeats that helps clarify which side you're on. And I think a lot of folks are drawing good conclusions from this.
Yeah, I feel really hopeful. Uh, so right, James. I know we say it's a defeat, but I think the way I've been thinking about it too, and I agree with what you're saying, but the way I think about it too is it's a defeat for what? And I think it's the defeat of one pathway of worker struggle, right? The pathway that says you work through labor law and through your union leadership, your bureaucratic leadership, who then work through that law to try to get a good deal for workers. And that pathway suffered a humiliating defeat and a really public one. But there's also all of these really interesting things that are happening right around this that basically are saying it's time for another pathway, right? The pathway that doesn't go through labor law and bureaucratic leadership working in backroom deals with the president, right? And I think we see the rumblings of something super interesting and powerful inside the labor movement, and in particular in the railway union, right? So we got we got this huge number of railway rank and file workers shoot down a bad deal and say, we don't want that. We want something better. Right. And expressing the outrage, like you're saying, James, right? The outrage at having a bad deal jammed down their throats. I think we see the Democrats recognizing that there's real power here, right? There's a real terror of the power that a strike could have. And there really is another pathway that, the defeated pathway is working through labor law, but there's another way, right? So Burns calls it class struggle unionism. I think it's becoming clear, and I think it's our job as union organizers and socialists to make it clear that the lesson here is labor law, we're going to have to break it. And I think that's also going to put us in a collision course with a lot of our union leaders whose jobs depend on working inside that law, and their power and influence comes from trying to broker deals using that law and all that sort of stuff. So that's going to mean organizing from below, like organizing on a rank and file level that's not afraid to break labor law. But this is the first time that labor's faced a problem like this, right? We saw in the massive wildcat struggles in the 1970s. We saw in the willingness to break labor law in the 1930s. As the working class, we've done it before, right? But I think it's a really painful sort of process to see the places we've put our faith get shut down. But there's other pathways that we can go. And I think there's something stirring in labor that's willing to say no to terrible deals.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. All of these laws that limit or forbid strikes, it's really important that working people, rank and file unionists, and working people begin to understand that they don't have to obey those laws. and to take them on and to dismantle them by breaking them, by going on strike. We saw that in Canada just a month, 2 months ago. They tried to cram that terrible anti-strike law down the throats of public sector workers, and their response wasn't to say, let's petition our legislature to vote no on this, or let's hold a rally in front of the state house. It was to strike, and they defeated that law. And that's how you defeat anti-strike laws, is by going on strike. In New York, we have the Taylor Law, and in New York City, public sector workers, with the exception of the TWU, many years ago, about more than a decade ago, haven't gone on strike, and almost never used that opportunity because of that law. So the Railway Labor Act, the Taylor Law, all of these have to be thrown out the window. And I feel like in this instance, a lot of rail workers really did think that they were not allowed to strike, even though the Railway Labor Act doesn't say that they can't. It just says they have to follow certain rules and procedures. But there was this sense, Congress voted, so now we can't do anything. And that just shows you the power that these laws have over workers, especially after so many years of a really weak, a really demoralized labor movement. And we're just sort of getting back into the groove now, it feels like, in the last, maybe, I like to go back to 2019. I mean, I think 2018, 2019, I think the teacher strikes were were an important shift.
And they were illegal.
And some of them were illegal. That's right. Yeah.
In Virginia, it was illegal.
Exactly. And I think COVID interrupted that a little bit. And we're picking it up again. And I really hope that workers are going to draw the right lessons from this and do exactly what you're saying, Jason, is to begin to challenge these laws and say, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're going to use our power to win, whatever it is,
And I don't know if others have experienced, but like in my union organizing and stuff, there's this perception that like just the law is the law. It's this sort of objective thing that's there. It's fair. We follow it, right? It's just this sort of neutral background we're supposed to follow. But I mean, what really becomes clear, like looking at the history of these laws, they were constructed consciously to stop us from striking, right? The people who crafted these laws, Robert Wagner, working with FDR in the 1930s, literally said the text of the Wagner Act in 1935 literally says the purpose of this law is to stop people from keeping profits from flowing. Some version of that, right? I think one big task is, as union organizers, as socialists, is to show that these laws are class war, right? These are not the trappings of a good democracy. These exist to attack us. They deserve to be broken. They're garbage.
They have to be.
I think that's an amazing place to end this discussion. And I guess I just want to say also one more time for the people in the back that this whole situation also shows, as we've said time and time and again, that the Democratic Party is a dead end. It's a party of capitalists. It's a party of imperialists. And as we've seen with the situation, as we've talked about today, they are a party of strike breakers. So on that note, I guess I just wanted to say, James and Jason, thank you both for being here. And I look forward to having you on the podcast in the future.
Thanks, Oden.
Thanks, folks.
Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/leftvoice.org, on Instagram at left_voice, and on Twitter at left_voice. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, and share the show with your friends, your family, coworkers, classmates, comrades, and anyone else who you want to radicalize. And finally, Left Voice is an independent, revolutionary socialist publication, which means that we completely rely on the support of our members and our sympathizers. So that we can continue to bring you more episodes of All That's Left, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftvoice. We're really excited about this project, and we hope that you'll join us on this journey.